In the last video, we followed the John Miller case, a Billy the Kid claimant who was literally exhumed for DNA. But that wasn't the final boss of this mystery, because the real question is still buried in New Mexico. Can anyone test the official Billy the Kid grave? And if not, why? Today, we're going to the place everyone argues about, and the reason this case might never be solved, even with modern forensics. Number 1, John Miller recap. So the John Miller exhumation actually happened. Not we heard rumors, not someone says they did it, but a real dig-up, real remains, real samples, real lab work. John Miller was an older man who died in 1937 and was buried in Prescott, Arizona. Years later, people started saying he had been Billy the Kid living under a different name. That's the core of the whole Billy the Kid afterlife industry. Pat Garrett shot the wrong guy, Billy slipped away, and he died decades later somewhere else. The Miller story was one of the few claims that didn't immediately collapse, mostly because it had just enough mystery attached to it to keep people arguing. Friends supposedly hinted about his identity, there were stories about his past, and there was that classic Wild West pattern where a guy keeps his mouth shut for years, until the legend gets profitable. The investigators chasing it were not random internet commenters. One was Tom Sullivan, a former sheriff from Lincoln County, New Mexico, and the other was Steve Sederwall, a former mayor from Capitan, New Mexico. They'd been chasing the kid's bones since around 2003, and when they couldn't get anywhere with the official grave in Fort Sumner, they switched to what felt like a workaround. Test a claimant first, then compare. Here's the part people don't always say out loud. The Miller exhumation wasn't some clean, universally approved museum-style project. It turned into a permission mess. Prosecutors ended up not filing charges because, from their perspective, it looked like officials at the cemetery gave permission, and the men believed they had permission. That's not the same thing as everything was perfectly authorized. But it explains why the case didn't end in someone getting dragged off in handcuffs. It also shows how touchy this topic is. You're dealing with human remains, laws, paperwork, ethics, and a legend that makes otherwise normal people act like they're in a treasure hunt movie. The plan, at least on paper, sounded straightforward. Get DNA from John Miller's remains and compare it to biological traces tied to Billy the Kid's death. A key piece of that story is the bench. There's a long-running claim that Billy's body was placed on a bench after he was killed in Fort Sumner in 1881, and that traces of blood might still exist in the wood. So the idea was basically Miller DNA versus bench DNA. That's the kind of pitch that makes people say, okay, finally, science is going to shut everyone up. Except it didn't. Reports later described the lab results as useless. And that single word is doing a ton of work because it can mean a bunch of different things. The DNA could be too degraded to read clearly. The sample could be mixed, more than one person's DNA. The sample could be contaminated. The usable portions could be too small to compare with confidence. Or the bench sample might not even be from the person people think it's from. The public hears DNA test and assumes it's a yes or no answer like a game show buzzer. In real forensics, especially historical forensics, DNA can be more like trying to recognize a face from a blurry reflection in dirty glass. Sometimes you can still do it, but sometimes all you can honestly say is, we can't tell. So if John Miller's dig-up didn't settle it, what does that tell you? It tells you the bigger mystery is still sitting in New Mexico, under the most argued over patch of ground in the Old West. Because even if you exhumed every claimant on Earth, the story still isn't finished until you answer the obvious question. Can anyone test the official Billy the Kid grave? And if they can't, who's stopping them and why? Number 2, the official grave. If you ever look up Billy the Kid's grave, you'll see something that feels almost too perfect a symbolism. The site is literally behind bars. The grave marker in Fort Sumner is enclosed in a metal cage, like the legend itself got arrested and never got released. The town describes the spot as the old military cemetery at Fort Sumner, where Billy was buried the day after he was killed, placed between his companions, Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder. Later, a single tombstone was put over the graves with a one-word epitaph: Pals. That's such a clean, movie-ready detail that it sounds invented, but it's part of what made the site famous in the first place. And the cage isn't just for drama. People kept stealing the marker. Not once, not twice, but repeatedly. Even the act of protecting the grave became part of the legend. The outlaw's grave needed lawmen. Now here's where the real grave argument kicks in. The official site is where tourists go, where photos get taken, where people stand and feel like they're touching the Wild West. But Fort Sumner isn't just a random dot on the map. The area has a heavy history. Fort Sumner was tied to the Bosque Redondo period in the 1860s, when native peoples were forcibly relocated there, and the place still carries that weight today through the Bosque Redondo Memorial. So you've got layers of history in one location: U.S. Army Fort, a painful chapter for native communities, then later the outlaw mythology that turned the same geography into a pop culture magnet. When people say, "Don't disturb the ground," they're not only talking about one celebrity outlaw, they're talking about a landscape that already holds too many stories. And physically, the ground itself has been part of the problem. Floods in the early 1900s are often mentioned in connection with the cemetery. Stories about markers being washed away, graves becoming uncertain, and the original "this exact spot" knowledge getting muddied over time. Some accounts say the flood basically scrambled the certainty of where exactly Billy lies. Other voices push back and say the idea that the body was literally washed away isn't backed by solid evidence. But either way, you end up in the same place: doubt. Even if the truth is, the remains probably stayed close. The fact that people can plausibly argue the remains might not be right under that marker is enough to jam up any clean forensic plan. That's why the official grave is both the most important target and the worst possible target. It's important because it's the anchor of the accepted story. Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid on July 14th, 1881, and the body was buried at Fort Sumner. But it's also a forensic nightmare because it's been visited, photographed, touched, protected, vandalized, fenced, and mythologized for generations. Every year that passes adds more human contact, more environmental exposure, and more confusion about what's original and what's been moved, replaced, repaired, or guessed. And then there's the big, quiet reality nobody wants to admit. Even if the grave is exactly where the marker says it is, and even if the remains are there, you still need a rock-solid comparison sample. Otherwise, you can dig up bones and end up with the same dead end you got with John Miller, just with way more drama and way more backlash. Number 3. Why this grave is the key. The John Miller case is like fighting the mini-boss. The Fort Sumner grave is the final boss. Because once you start talking about Billy the Kid claimants, you realize the entire survival theory lives on one unspoken rule. The official grave can't be tested in a way everyone accepts. As long as that's true, the door stays cracked open for every what if. What if Garrett shot the wrong man? What if there was a switch? What if the body was buried fast because someone knew something? What if the grave marker is more like a memorial than a map pin? If you could do a clean, well-documented, legally approved exhumation of the official grave and get a usable DNA profile, you'd instantly change the whole conversation. Because then claimants become easy to evaluate. Not, did he look like Billy? Not, did he tell convincing stories? Not, does his town have a museum now? You'd just be comparing biological identity. That's why everyone circles back to Fort Sumner. That patch of ground is the choke point. But the reason it's a choke point isn't just science. It's also politics, money, identity, and basic human stubbornness. Fort Sumner is a small rural community, and the grave is a tourism magnet. People stop for gas, snacks, museum tickets, souvenirs, maybe a night in town. That matters. When someone shows up saying, "We want to dig it up," locals don't hear, "We're doing a neutral scientific project." They hear, "You're messing with our town's biggest draw." It's not hard to see why the reaction can get heated fast. And it's also personal. Even if you don't like the idea of turning an outlaw into a folk hero, the Billy the Kid story is baked into New Mexico history. Some people grew up with it as part of family storytelling, part of local pride, part of the cultural landscape. When outsiders, or even nearby officials, push for an exhumation, it can feel like somebody trying to grab the steering wheel of your own history. Plus, the grave isn't just Billy. The official story says he was buried between Tom O'Folliard and Charlie Boder, friends and fellow outlaws. So if you dig there, you're not dealing with one person's remains in a neat, labeled box. You're dealing with a burial area that represents multiple lives. That means more stakeholders, more ethical questions, and more potential for the project to spiral into something people regret. So this is why the Fort Sumner grave is the key. It's where myth and reality physically collide. It's a tourist site and a burial site. It's a symbol and a possible evidence source. It's protected like a museum artifact and treated like sacred ground. And that's before you even get to the question that causes the most arguments. Who actually has the legal right to say yes or no? Number 4, who gets to say no? When people casually say, why don't they just test the body? They're imagining something like a TV lab scene where a technician swabs something and a computer spits out the truth. In real life, the first battle isn't in the dirt. It's in the paperwork. Disinterment, digging up human remains, usually requires legal permission. That can involve cemetery authorities, local government, sometimes state agencies, and often a court order. And if there are known relatives, their wishes can matter a lot, depending on the laws and the situation. Now add one more twist that makes this story feel unreal. At one point in the broader Billy the Kid DNA push, it was reported that New Mexico's governor assigned an attorney to represent Billy the Kid's interests. Think about that for a second. A guy who died in 1881 ends up with something like legal representation in the modern era, because his name and legacy are still powerful enough to spark serious legal and political moves. That's not normal. That's legend level. And then there's the reality that the official grave isn't the same as a private family plot. It's a historic cemetery site tied to a community and its history. People who live there can feel protective in a way that outsiders underestimate. It's not simply, we own the land, so we decide. It becomes, we're responsible for the site, so we decide. Which is a totally different vibe. Also, the moment you propose an exhumation, you invite a chain reaction. If you allow Billy the Kid to be exhumed, what happens next? Do you get another team in 2 years wanting to double check? Do you get a new documentary crew every season wanting their own samples? Do you turn a cemetery into a revolving door? Local officials can worry that one yes becomes a permanent yes forever. And there's a genuine ethical side too. Even if someone was an outlaw, they were still a human being. Digging up remains for entertainment, for content, or for bragging rights makes people uncomfortable. That discomfort isn't automatically anti-science. Sometimes it's just basic respect. The problem is, the Billy the Kid conversation is never purely respectful and never purely scientific. It's always tangled up with fame, money, and attention. So even people who like the idea of solving the mystery might not trust the process or the motives. This is where the phrase permission war makes perfect sense. Because the fight isn't only about whether the science could work, it's also about whether the community believes the people asking are the right people, whether the project has a serious purpose, and whether the benefits outweigh the risk of turning a grave into a spectacle. Number 5, the permission war. The pushback in New Mexico wasn't subtle. In 2004, when law enforcement figures were pushing the idea of exhuming Billy the Kid's remains, the mayor of Fort Sumner, Raymond Lopez, publicly criticized it and described it as a misguided publicity stunt. He even used harsh language about the people behind it, and the reporting at the time made it clear that locals saw the proposal as a threat to the town's tourism lifeline. That's not a minor disagreement. That's a full-on, keep your hands off our legend moment. And the defenders didn't only argue feelings, they argued practicality. They questioned why this was being done, who benefits, and whether it was truly a legitimate investigation or just a big headline machine. Because let's be honest, Billy the Kid is the kind of name that sells books, sells documentaries, sells museum tickets, sells merch, sells road trips. The moment you attach DNA mystery to it, you've basically built a content factory. Locals know that. They're not naive. Meanwhile, the people pushing for exhumation weren't saying, "We just want attention." Their argument was, "This is a historic question. We have modern tools. We can check the story." And in a way, that's fair. If you're serious about history, the idea that a major American legend might be testable is hard to ignore. It feels like leaving the answer sitting on the table. So you end up with two sides talking past each other. One side hears, "We're going to bring science to the Wild West." The other side hears, "You're going to turn our cemetery into a circus and then leave." Both sides can point to real reasons. Also, it didn't help that this wasn't a simple criminal case. Nobody is going to court today because Billy the Kid died in 1881. There isn't a modern victim seeking justice, there isn't a current danger to the public, and there isn't a legal urgency that forces everyone to cooperate. It's history. And because it's history, people treat it like a choice. You can also feel the irony here. In the Old West, the line between lawman and politician was blurry. Sheriffs were public figures. Rewards and reputation mattered. Power networks shaped what got written down and what got lost. Fast forward to today, and you still have politics shaping what happens. It's just not six-shooters and posses anymore. It's city councils, court petitions, public opinion, and who can make the loudest case without looking like the bad guy. And if you're wondering why the John Miller team pivoted to Arizona, this is why. According to reporting on that case, after more than a year of fighting to get permission to unearth the Fort Sumner grave, they dropped the request and tried the process of elimination approach somewhere else. That alone tells you how solid the wall was around the official grave. It wasn't just a locked gate, it was a locked system. Number 6, proof is a battlefield. Let's say, hypothetically, you get permission tomorrow. Paper signed, court order approved, archaeologists on site, everything done the right way. You still have a nasty question waiting for you. What exactly are you testing? People talk like Billy the Kid is buried in a single labeled slot, like a modern cemetery plot with a neat paper trail. But the Fort Sumner story comes from 1881, in a territory, in a small community, in a time when record-keeping wasn't always clean, and the physical environment has been rough over the decades. Some accounts say flood events washed away markers and made it difficult to be certain about exact locations. There are also stories that, years later, people tried to identify the burial spot from memory and didn't all point to the same exact place. That's huge. Because if 3 people who were there can't agree, modern investigators can't pretend it's a simple GPS coordinate. Then you have the PALS marker problem. The tombstone that became iconic wasn't placed right after his death. It came later. And the more time that passes between burial and permanent marker placement, the more room there is for memory to get fuzzy and for the ground to shift, literally and socially. And even if you excavate the spot under the marker, what if you find remains that are not clearly separable? Burials close together can lead to mixing over time. Soil movement, flooding, repairs, reburials, animal activity. None of it cares about your documentary budget. In forensic terms, you can end up with commingled remains, meaning bones that belong to more than one individual mixed together. That's one of the fastest ways to turn "we're getting the truth" into "we have a complicated pile of questions." This is also where chain of custody becomes everything. If you want a DNA conclusion that historians, scientists, courts, and the public will accept, you need to document every step. Who handled the remains? How samples were taken? How they were stored? Where they were sent? What lab methods were used? How contamination was prevented? And how results were interpreted? If any part is sloppy, the results become a forever argument. People will just say, "That's not real," and the mystery stays alive. And there's a weird psychological trap too. If the DNA test says, "This is not Billy," a ton of people will celebrate, and a ton of people will panic. But if the DNA test says, "This probably is Billy," you'll still get denial because the survival myth has become its own culture. For some folks, the myth is more fun than the truth. For others, the myth is personal identity, like their town's claim to fame, their family story, their life's work. So even good results can inflame the conflict instead of settling it. That's why proof itself becomes a battlefield. The science has to fight the ground, the paperwork, the history, and the human need to keep legends alive. Number 7. The reference sample problem. DNA doesn't magically identify someone out of thin air. You almost always need something to compare it to. Think of it like matching a fingerprint. You need a known print in a system, or you need a close relative's print, or you need some other anchor. With old remains, the best anchor is often mitochondrial DNA, which passes down the maternal line. That means Billy's mother becomes incredibly important to the whole plan. Billy the kid's mother, Catherine Antrim, is associated with a burial in Silver City, New Mexico, at what's now known as Memory Lane Cemetery. Investigators wanted to exhume her remains so they could get a maternal DNA profile and then compare it to whatever was under the Billy marker in Fort Sumner. On paper, that's logical. If the Fort Sumner remains share maternal DNA with Catherine, you've got a strong link. But that plan ran into a brick wall too. Silver City officials pushed back hard. The public language around it wasn't gentle. People didn't want the town turned into a circus, and they didn't like the idea of disturbing graves for what they viewed as publicity. Then a judge got involved. In 2004, a district judge declined to rule in a way that would allow Catherine's exhumation, and basically said, in effect, that investigators would need to locate Billy's burial site and collect his DNA first before returning to ask about exhuming the mother. If that sounds like a catch-22, that's because it is. Because the whole point of exhuming the mother was to help confirm Billy. But the judge's stance was essentially, prove you can get Billy first, then we'll talk about the mother. That flips the order and makes the plan way harder. There was also talk about using other relatives, like Billy's half-brother, Joseph Antrim, who died in 1930, if his remains could be located. That's another if. Old graves aren't always easy to find, and even when you find a marker, you can run into the same permission issues all over again. So the situation becomes almost absurd. The one grave everyone wants to test is the hardest to access, and the best comparison sample is also blocked. Without that comparison anchor, you can dig up bones and still not be able to say what they prove. And this is where some people misunderstand DNA mystery. The mystery isn't that science is weak. The mystery is that science needs cooperation, access, permission, documentation, reference samples. If any one of those is missing, the whole project can fail even if the lab techs are world-class. Number 8, forensics reality check. Let's talk honestly about why the John Miller lab work could end up being described as useless, because this is the part that saves you from overpromising the audience. Old DNA is fragile. Heat, moisture, bacteria, time, everything breaks it down. Sometimes you can get usable DNA from old bones, but it's not guaranteed. And if the remains were exposed to water damage or shifting soil conditions, the DNA can be even more degraded. Now add the bench sample problem. A bench that's been around for over a century is not a sterile evidence locker. It's wood, which absorbs and holds all kinds of biological material over time. People touch it. Dust settles on it. Microbes live in it. If it's been moved, cleaned, repaired, handled, displayed, or even just stored in changing conditions, you've got a contamination party. So even if there was once blood from 1881 on that bench, you're fighting a ton of noise. You might get a DNA mixture, tiny fragments from multiple individuals blended together. Mixtures are hard even in modern cases. In historical cases, they can become nearly impossible to untangle. Also, you have to question the story itself. Are we 100% sure that bench is the bench? Is the chain of custody solid from 1881 to now? Or is it more like a tradition? This is the bench people say it was, which is a totally different level of reliability. And then there's another harsh reality. Even when you get a partial DNA profile, partial doesn't always mean useful. You might get small fragments that can't distinguish between lots of people. Or you might get mitochondrial DNA that can say, This person belongs to a broad maternal line, but can't pinpoint a single identity without a strong comparison sample. So if someone says, DNA can't solve it, what they often mean is, DNA can't solve it with the evidence and access we currently have. If you want to be fair, you don't hype DNA as a magic wand, and you don't trash it like it's pointless. You say the real thing. DNA is powerful, but it's picky. It needs the right conditions, the right samples, and the right comparisons. And even if you did everything perfectly, you still have to deal with public trust. If the testing is done by a small private team with no transparency, people will doubt it. If it's done by a government agency, some people will still doubt it. If it's done by a university, people will argue the politics. The Billy the Kid story has reached that level where the facts don't always matter as much as who delivers the facts. So the forensics reality check here is pretty simple. A DNA test can be inconclusive for totally boring reasons, and an inconclusive result is not a cover-up. It's just what happens when you try to pull clean biological identity out of a 19th century legend that's been handled, argued, and physically disturbed by time. Number 9. Paper trails and missing proof. Here's the part that surprises a lot of people. Even the paperwork around Billy the Kid's death has been argued over for decades. New Mexico was a territory at the time, and it didn't issue death certificates the way we think of them today. When a death mattered, a coroner's jury could be assembled to hold an inquiry, and their report could serve as official recognition. There are historical discussions about reports being written, copies being made, Spanish language documentation being involved, and later confusion about where certain records ended up. This is why you see modern efforts that sound almost ridiculous at first, like a historian petitioning for the state to officially issue a death certificate for Billy the Kid long after the fact. In 2015, Robert Stahl petitioned for that kind of certification, arguing that the historical record supported the conclusion that Billy died as the official story says. Whether or not you agree with every detail of the argument, the fact that someone even tried tells you how messy the official proof has become in the public imagination. If the average person thinks there's no death certificate, they treat that like a loophole, like a missing stamp means the death didn't happen. Then you get the open record side of the story, which is basically the modern version of an Old West standoff. Only it's fought with lawyers instead of rifles. There was a long legal fight over access to records related to the Billy the Kid investigations, including forensic evidence and testing work. The dispute lasted years and cost serious money in fees and damages, with a judge at one point awarding punitive damages before later appeals actions changed parts of the outcome. The key point isn't the legal technicalities. The point is the vibe. Even the documents became a battlefield, and it fits the pattern. In the Wild West era, reputation and narrative mattered. Pat Garrett wasn't just a lawman, he was a public figure whose story shaped how people understood the killing. In the modern era, narrative still matters. The fight moved from saloons and newspapers to courts and public record requests, but the core drama is the same. Who controls the story? Who gets believed? And what counts as proof? So when someone says, "Why is this still a debate in 2026?" the answer isn't because people are stupid. The answer is because the story sits right at the intersection of myth and missing certainty. The documents aren't clean enough to shut everyone up. The grave situation isn't clean enough to make testing simple, and the DNA situation isn't clean enough to deliver the kind of headline people want. That's basically the perfect recipe for an endless mystery. Number 10. The grave that won't give up its name. At this point, you can almost see why the Fort Sumner grave has become the center of the storm. It's not just a burial site, it's a symbol. You've got a famous outlaw whose life story blurred into legend almost immediately. A lawman whose account shaped history, claimants who kept the survival story alive, and modern investigators trying to drag the whole thing into the bright, unforgiving light of forensic science. And then you've got the thing that sounds like a punchline but isn't. The grave is literally caged. The marker has been stolen enough times that the town had to treat it like a protected object. That alone tells you what kind of magnet this legend is. People don't steal just any old grave marker. They steal icons. So when people say, "someone stopped them," it isn't one shadowy villain in a black hat. It's a wall built out of normal, very human forces. Local officials protecting a community's identity and economy, courts trying to prevent reckless disturbance of graves, historians arguing over what counts as real evidence, and the simple fact that time has a way of wrecking both DNA and certainty. The legend survives because it has room to survive. If you zoom out, the whole Billy the Kid DNA mystery is really about what happens when a story becomes bigger than the person. In 1881, a young outlaw dies, and a town buries him quickly. Over a century later, you've got legal battles, excavations in another state, samples shipped to labs, arguments about floods and missing markers, and people still trying to pin down the simplest question imaginable. Who is actually in the ground? And the weird part is, even if the science gets better, which it will, the story still needs something science can't manufacture: permission, cooperation, and a comparison point everyone agrees on. Until those pieces line up, the real grave stays real in the most frustrating way possible. Real enough to visit, real enough to argue over, and just out of reach enough that the mystery can keep breathing every time somebody stands at that cage in Fort Sumner and thinks, what if?